Hello, everyone. I am so excited to be back. It's your boy, War Crimes Uwu, and today we are diving into our limited guide for Modern Horizons 3. Now, I know I've only done standard sets before for these limited guides, and don't expect this for every tentpole set, because I truly do loathe Universes Beyond, but this is not Universes Beyond, this is Modern Horizons 3, a set that, despite the unfortunate pack price, looks like it will pack a very interesting limited format. Modern Horizons 2 was, in my opinion, one of the greatest limited formats of all time, even being worth the price tag, in my opinion, to draft at the local game store. And this one, you can actually get on Arena for the same price as a normal draft. So I expect this format to have a lot more attention paid to it. It's definitely going to have its limits tested by some a larger mass of skilled players. And I want to help you get ahead of the curve. I want to help you figure out the archetypes, the bombs, all the things you will need to know to be successful in your Modern Horizons 3 pre-release, and especially in your Modern Horizons 3 drafts. So without further ado, let's get into the table of contents. For those who are new here, this is the shape that my guides sort of take. They're not a full set review, but they're intended to teach you the outlines of the set, the important cards for each archetype, the best commons and uncommons in each color, the mechanics, so that you understand how the mechanics work, and then kind of the best bombs, and then tips and tricks for the format, just to put yourself a little bit ahead and help you understand what's going on. Just if you only have a little over an hour to get into the format, that my video will be the best use of that time, is my goal. So, we're going to start by talking about the returning mechanics, and Horizon sets are pretty unique in this regard, in that they do not pull punches in terms of mechanical complexity. There's not a few core mechanics that the set is more built around. I mean, there are a few mechanics that the set is more built around, but those are not the exclusive mechanics that appear at most rarities. Horizon sets are not afraid to take a mechanic that, was last seen a few years ago and just make one card with it. And they include the reminder text where they can, but it definitely expects you to kind of have more of a knowledge base about mechanics. And that doesn't mean a beginner player can't play it, but you're going to get the most enjoyment and success out of these sets if you've been around the block a little bit and you're good at either understanding already what these keyword mechanics from past sets do, or you're good at internalizing that information quickly through the reminder text and evaluating the cards that way. So here we've got Nyxborn Hydra, a card with Bestow, a mechanic we last saw in original Theros block. We've got a Saga here. There's a few Sagas in the set. And then we've got this support. That's a mechanic that was last seen in Battle for Zendikar, Oath of the Gatewatch. Maybe, I don't actually know if it returned in Oath of the Gatewatch. Maybe it debuted in Oath of the Gatewatch. It was one of those sets. Those limited formats are not very memorable. But anyway, so there are a lot of mechanics that are kind of one-offs, right? In a Modern Horizons set, you might see one card with Ninjutsu, one card with Overload, one or two cards with Escape, right? Nothing is off limits. So the more general knowledge of magic mechanics that you have, the better. But it's not strictly necessary to enjoy the set. Just something to be aware of, that you're not. It's not a set like with the last one, like Outlaws at Thunder Junction, where I learn what plot does, I learn what outlaws are, I learn what crimes are, and then I'm one or two more mechanics, and then I'm good. There are a lot of mechanics to digest, but those mechanics come together to form a sort of broader mechanical identity for the color pairs, which we'll get into later. Just be aware of that. There are some returning mechanics that are more focused on than others, in terms of being a large part of the set, and one of those is modal dual-faced lands. Now, these debuted and were very popular in the Zendikar Rising set, and they come back here, right? On a series of uncommons, there's some monocolored uncommons where you can pay 3 life to have the land on the back come in untapped, and there are some hybrid uncommons, which are actually really interesting for their splash potential, because on the front side is a hybrid card, right? You can cast it for either of the two colors, and then on the back is a tap land that taps for either of those two colors, so you can use it as fixing, and also as a flexible card you can cast. And honestly, most of these look pretty powerful, right? This Blood-Soaked Insight especially is kind of crazy in terms of, you just hit your opponent in combat first, and then you can cast this for maybe 2 or 3 mana, and you just get 3 cards off the top of their library. Or this fine-costed fight spell with a potentially untapped green land on the back. And there's a whole cycle of these, right? There's 2 of each monocolor uncommon that can come in untapped on the land side if you pay 3 life, and then there's 1 of each hybrid pair. So be on the lookout for these in draft as just very much smoothing for your deck, right? You play these, you can count it as a land for your land count, so you essentially are going to get to play 24 spells, 25 spells, 26 spells, depending on how many of these you get. So that's definitely something to keep a lookout for, but, the way that they work is very intuitive. You can play the front side as the spell that it is, or when you play it, you can play the backside as a land. Very simple. Another returning mechanic that's emphasized here is energy. Now, energy as a mechanic was introduced in Kaladesh and carried into the following set, Aether Revolt, and they're basically counters that a player gets, and you give yourself energy counters by effects, and then you spend them with effects, right? So in this case, we've got basically a lightning bolt that uses energy. We've got the set's white tapper that's energy based, and then this sort of multi-function card that just taps to give you energy, or you can tap and pay energy in different increments to get different effects. So energy is one of the core mechanics of the set because it kind of has to be. It's a mechanic that you have to include a lot of cards that support it in order to have it be worth including in a set. So it's very much out there. Several of the limited archetypes are kind of built around energy. There are some cards that are just good enough on rate that if you're not using any other energy cards, they're still worth playing. I would say Galvanic Discharge is one of them because it's a lightning bolt to a creature or a planeswalker, even if you have no other energy in your deck. But obviously, these cards get stronger by virtue of being more flexible the more energy cards you are able to draft and include. And we'll get into that later with some of the archetypes that are focused on utilizing energy to the fullest extent. Moving on next to the returning mechanic of Modified. Now, Modified debuted, feels like a weird word for it, but it was kind of categorized in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. And all that Modified means is that a creature has either a counter on it, or an equipment, or an aura you control on it. So basically, if you have augmented your creature in one of those 3 ways, then that creature counts as Modified. And in that set, it was in all colors. And in this set, there's some of it in a few colors, but it's especially in Abzan, right? So white, green, black. There are cards that care if your creatures are modified. So like this funky-looking fella, the Temperamental Oozewag, gives your modified creatures trample. This Expanding Ooze puts counters on modified creatures when it attacks. So you have a lot of different ways to modify. A lot of cards with Adapt, which is that mechanic from Ravnica Allegiance, where if the creature does not already have counters on it, you can pay the adapt cost to put counters on it, so basically one time you can adapt it, and then that creature becomes modified. There's plenty of equipment in the set, plenty of auras, bestow, things we'll get into later, but Modified is a core mechanic of the set, so if you're going to memorize a couple mechanics in the set, I would say Energy and Modified are 2 of the biggest ones. Returning mechanic, Devoid / Colorless Matters. So this is a mechanic that debuted in a very controversial block. Battle for Zendikar and Oath of the Gatewatch were blocks whose limited formats were received in very mixed ways. But Devoid is essentially, it's a mechanic that doesn't mean anything on its own. It just means the card doesn't have a color, which doesn't matter unless something cares about the card's color. But there are plenty of things like this Titan's Vanguard that can put a counter on each colorless creature you control. So that's going to trigger on your Devoid cards, or that's going to include your Devoid cards, even though you have to pay a specific specific color of mana to cast them. And then as well, there are cards that specifically require colorless mana in the form of that diamond symbol. You cannot use colored mana for those. You have to sacrifice an Eldrazi Spawn, for example, or use a non-basic land that provides colorless mana, or use a Wastes. And here we see 3 cards that utilize that. So this Eldrazi Ravager, which costs colorless mana to actually be cast. This Twisted Riddle Keeper, which costs colorless mana in its Emerge cost. This Spawn Gang Commander, which is sort of an Eldrazi riff on Siege Gang Commander that requires you to use colorless mana to activate it. So that's just specifically colorless mana. There's also a bonus sheet in this set, although it's not as splashy or thematic as the bonus sheets in most sets. And if you are not already familiar with a lot of these cards, then there won't be much of a distinction between the bonus sheet and the main set, because the bonus sheet does not have a mechanical identity as far as limited goes, per se. Rather, it includes cards that already existed in Magic, but are new to Modern. And many of these cards just don't have a function in Limited. Like, you'd be hard-pressed to find a deck that wants to play Brea Ethereum Sculptor in Limited, or Kalia of the Vast, past. These are just cool cards that needed a reprint that would maybe be fun to play in casual Modern decks. Some of them are relatively powerful. I don't know, I couldn't tell you necessarily which ones I think will be heavy hitters in Modern because I've been out of that format for a while, but definitely some interesting limited players here. So I've included Deep Analysis, which is, a great tool for one of the decks in particular that we'll get into later, the Draw 3 deck. Lets you draw cards, and you can flash it back as well to draw 2 more cards. Nadir's Nightblade, just a cool token leaving the battlefield trigger, enabler. You can kind of use that as a build around. And then Meteoric Mace, which is a big equipment with Cascade. So sort of lets you hopefully find a creature to put it on if you don't already have one. But yeah, so there's a bonus sheet of new to Modern cards. Some of those rares are pretty powerful. There's Lelia the Blade Reforged. Kappa Cannoneer, less powerful for limited, more for constructed, but those types of cards. So in every pack, you will have one card that is on the bonus sheet that is new to Modern, and the way that you tell is that it has a watermark that is the set symbol of the set that it debuted in. But its set symbol on the actual card will still be Modern Horizons 3. All right, and here's where I have to do the call to action. Just real quick, I would appreciate any subscription you want to toss my way, a like on the video. A comment goes a long way. My favorite thing to do, honestly, more than playing Magic, is discussing it. So, I read the comments. I love to reply to comments and talk about the limited format, so feel free to do that. But yeah, a subscription would really be appreciated, but I won't hold you on that for any longer. We're going to talk about the best commons and uncommons sorted by color. So these are the commons and uncommons that you want to look out for in a draft, that you want to make a note of when you are building your sealed pool, and that you're thinking, okay, if I'm seeing these in the middle of the pack, probably means the color's open, because these commons and uncommons are the most powerful in each color. So we're going to start with the best white commons, and I'm going to read them all out to you. We're going to start with Area Auxiliary. 3 and a white for a 3/3 flying bird soldier. When Area Auxiliary enters the battlefield, support 2. Now what support 2 means is put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 other target creatures. So you can't put those counters on the same creature, you can't put them on the Auxiliary. But in any aggro deck where you're kind of going wide, this is insane rate. A 4-mana 3/3 flyer that buffs 2 creatures, so those +1/+1 counters, that power that's hitting the board essentially has haste, because you're putting it on creatures that were already there. Very, very sauced. And then we've got Nyxborn Unicorn, which is another one of these bestow cards. Maybe there were enough bestow cards in the set that I should have explained that mechanic, so we'll just explain it here for those who don't know. So the base cost is 1 and a white for a 2/2 enchantment creature Unicorn with Mentor. Now what bestow does is for 3 and a white, if you cast this card for its bestow cost, it's an aura spell with enchant creature. It becomes a creature again if it's not attached. So basically that means you can cast this as an aura, targeting one of your creatures, and then if that creature dies or leaves the battlefield some other way, and this falls off, instead of going to the graveyard like a normal aura, it just becomes its creature form. So 2/2 Mentor. And then enchanted creature gets +2/+2 in Mentor. Now, 9 times out of 10, these bestow creatures will just give their stats and abilities to the thing they bestow. Sometimes instead they'll change it, they'll do something weird. That's why it's written out every time so that you know what the bestow specifically does. But this one gives the enchanted creature +2/+2 and Mentor. And for those who don't remember, Mentor is a mechanic from Guilds of Ravnica. Whenever this creature attacks, you put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature with lesser power. So, you put this on something, it's probably going to be the biggest thing you control, and it starts buffing the other things when it attacks. So, very powerful. So, worth noting, and we'll get into this later, that the decks that care about modified, this is not only modifying the creature you bestow it on, but it's also then modifying the creature it mentors by putting a counter on it. So, it's a way to get 2 modified creatures at least for 1 card. And then we've got Thraben Charm, 1 and a white for an instant. Choose 1. Thraben Charm deals damage equal to twice the number of creatures you control to target creature. Destroy target enchantment. Exile any number of target players' graveyards. So, probably 8 times out of 10, you're going to be using that first mode to deal twice the number of creatures you control and damage to target creature. So, 1 creature is doing 2. 2 creatures is doing 4. If you have 3 creatures, it's probably killing anything. But 2 creatures is a reasonable thing to expect. And so 4 damage for an instant on a white. Great. And it is Thraben Charm dealing the damage, so, sometimes these effects will have the creatures do 1 damage each, and then Lifelink and Death Touch come into play. That's not the case with Thraben Charm, so it's important to remember the charm itself is doing the damage. But that's getting into the weeds a little bit. The Destroy an Enchantment mode, the Exile any number of target players' graveyards mode, wonderful to have, just in case they're relevant, but the card is carried by the strength of that first mode, which makes the flexibility of the other modes feel good, because you're not really losing anything by including this card in your deck, and having that ability to destroy enchantments as well, or exile graveyards. Moving on to the best uncommons in white, we've got Muster the Departed. Muster on the beat. 2 and a white for an enchantment. When Muster the Departed enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. And Morbid, at the beginning of your end step, if a creature died this turn, populate. So it's worth noting that if they kill that spirit and you don't have any other tokens, it's real rough because, that Morbid's going to trigger, but then there's not going to be anything to populate. It doesn't just make another 1/1 flyer unless you already have the 1/1 flyer. But on the flip side, if you have a better token than that 1/1 flyer, you can populate that instead. So, definitely some power heroes to build around. We've got Charitable Levy. Beautiful art here, by the way, by Eli Manaya. Shout out to that artist. Charitable Levy is 1 and a white for an enchantment. Non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast. Whenever a player casts a non-creature spell, put a collection counter on Charitable Levy. Then if there are 3 or more collection counters on it, sacrifice it. If you do, draw a card, then you may search your library for a Plains card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. So we've got, Thalia or Vryn Wingmare in the form of an enchantment rather than a creature. So harder to remove right off the bat. But also, once 3 people have paid that tax to cast their non-creature spells, this is probably not relevant anymore, so it's going to replace itself with a card in a tapped Plains. I think this card's quite good, especially if you're kind of pushing through with an aggro creature deck, or even just a mid-range deck. As long as you are not hurting yourself with that tax more than your opponent, which it's pretty easy to make sure that you're not. This card is definitely going to be putting in work. And then we've got the first saga we're actually going to read. There's a cycle of sagas that are based on the deeds that the characters depicted on the flip planeswalkers in this set committed. So this one is Ajani's. It's Ajani Fells the Godsire. 3 and double white. Exile target creature an opponent controls with power 3 or greater. Step 2, create a 2/1 white cat warrior creature token, then put a vigilance counter on a creature you control. Step 3, target creature you control gains double strike until end of turn. So this is sort of like the Spirit Halloween version of Elspeth Conquers Death. But Elspeth Conquers Death is a powerful card, so the Spirit Halloween version is still pretty decent. 5 mana to exile a creature with power 3 or greater. That's going to be many creatures that you want to answer by the time you have 5 mana. Maybe a little slow, but whatever. The 2/1 and then Vigilance counter on a creature you control. The floor on that is a 2/1 Vigilance, which is, a fine rider to get on a spell like this. The other big upside being that you can put that counter on something else, of course. And then target creature you control gains double strike until end of turn. Just lets you push through some damage at the end of this. So, a very versatile card, and one of those sagas where, each of the modes is a little underwhelming, but it's more than the sum of its parts. So definitely an uncommon I'd be happy to get and play, assuming that the format isn't ridiculously aggressive to the point where this card is not useful, but I don't see that happening. We're going to move into the next color, blue, and we've got some cool cards. So one thing Modern Horizons just loves to do is reference. They love referencing old cards. They love doing cards that are riffs on old cards, especially iconic cards like Colossal Dreadmaw, Stormcrow, cards that have become Reddit memes and then died, and then, Magic is on a 2-year development cycle. So they get to them after they're dead. But this card, Serum Visionary, is a reference or a riff on the classic cantrip Serum Visions. What Serum Visionary does, he's a 2 and a blue for a 2/2 Vidalcan Wizard at common. When Serum Visionary enters the battlefield, draw a card, then scry 2. You'll, of course, recognize that as the text of Serum Visions if you've been playing for a while, or if you played back when that card was good in Modern. This card's awesome. It's a pretty insane rate. To add the Scry 2 to drawing a card off a 3-mana 2/2, which is typically fine and limited in the first place, just to adding Scry 2 is crazy. This would have been crazier in one of the Modern Horizons, in the original Modern Horizons, where Blink was a key theme. There's still some ways to blink creatures, but mainly you're just going to be getting the value off of this enter the battlefield once and being very happy with it on rate. So Serum Visionary, great card. Happy to run a good number of these in my deck. Utter Insignificance, 1 and a blue for a Flash Aura. Enchanted creature loses all abilities and has base power and toughness 1/1. 2 and a colorless, exile enchanted creature. So very easy to just flash this in combat and then eat something huge your opponent was attacking with. There was a similar spell in Lost Caverns of Ixalan that was eaten by piranhas or something that achieved a similar goal just by virtue of having flash. It's a combat trick. You eat their big thing by turning it into a 1/1. But you also have the option to, if they're not taking the bait, not putting the creature into combat, but you still need to deal with it, you can exile it for 2 and a colorless and just have it gone. And then we've got Deem Inferior, 3 and a blue for a sorcery. This spell costs 1 less to cast for each card you've drawn this turn. The owner of target non-land permanent puts it into their library second from the top or on the bottom. Now, worth noting here, this effect we've seen them tinker with for the past several sets, and it seems like they keep trying to make it a little bit more powerful each time, just to kind of find where the sweet spot is, because it's always like okay to play, but it's never great. This version, let me tell you, is pretty good. That mana cost is a bit of a lie because it's a sorcery and you draw a card on each of your turns. So, it's never going to actually be 4. It's always going to be at least 3 or less. You draw other cards other ways. You can get this down to 2 or 1. It's not that hard to get it down to 1. But even just paying 3 for this, right, which is what you should be evaluating it at, the card's fine. It doesn't put it right on the top like other versions of this effect does, so, you're making them wait another turn, ideally, to have access to the thing again if they do want access to it again. And if they don't, if they just put it on the bottom, then you still answered it. So very, very happy to see this card, and you can put away their threat until maybe you can deal with it. So that always feels good. And now we're going to talk about the best blue uncommons, and of course I'm including cards with Devoid that cost blue because you're putting them in a blue deck, obviously. So we've got Hope Ender Coatl, 2 and a blue for a 2/2 flash flyer with Devoid. When you cast this spell, counter target spell an opponent controls unless they pay 1. So this card is brutal when it lines up correctly. A 2/2 flyer for 3 that counters their spell is a nightmare. It's backbreaking. Is this always going to line up? No. If this is a 2-mana 1/1 flyer, it'd be a lot better because it would at least line up a lot more. But very often, on their turn 3, they're not just playing a 2-drop. They're trying to play a 3-drop. And when that happens, it's going to be pretty devastating to get it countered, and then you have a 2/2 flyer ready to attack immediately. And then we've got Copy Crook, 2 and double blue for a Shapeshifter Rogue at uncommon. You may have Copy Crook enter the battlefield as a copy of any creature on the battlefield, except it has, whenever this creature attacks, connives. For those who don't remember the connive mechanic from Streets of New Capenna, it's just draw a card, then discard a card, then the conniving creature gets a counter if that card was a spell rather than a land. So Copy Crook is really cool, 4 mana for a clone is fine. But the fact that creature has the ability to generate some card filtering and then, on its first attack, become bigger than the thing it copied, right? Because you can put a counter on it. Very, very, very useful. Blue is decent uncommons this time around, and Copy Crook is definitely one I'm relatively happy to have in the format. Again, unless the format goes very aggro. And then we've got Brain Surge here, 2 and a blue for an instant. Draw 4 cards, then put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library in any order. So it's Brainstorm, but you want more card, but it costs 2 more mana. Not a trade-off that we like. Obviously, you'd rather just play Brainstorm, but still quite a powerful card, right? You are actually going up a card in addition to the card selection instead of going neutral on cards like Brainstorm does. It'll fit into a lot of decks by just giving you that card selection at 3 mana. That's very premium rate, as well as triggering the cards that care about you drawing 3 cards in a turn, which we'll see a few of later. So definitely a card I'm happy to have access to in Limited. And then we're going to go into the best black commons. We're starting with Fetid Gargantua, 4 and a black for a 4/4 horror. And it adapts for 2 and a black for adapts 2. So if this creature has no +1/+1 counters on it, put 2 counters on it. Whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on Fetid Gargantua, you may draw 2 cards. If you do, lose 2 life. So it's sort of a variant on that classic Phyrexian Gargantua, except it sort of gets the counters at a later time. You're kind of paying for it in installments, but it ends up as a 6/6. So, there's something there. And then if you have other ways to put counters on it via other effects, you draw more cards later, which is obviously sort of the best case scenario here. But yeah, it's just a decent body. Gets the counters later. You do it at instant speed, which is pretty relevant. We've got Wither and Bloom which I think is an insane card. Just very efficient removal. So it's 1 and a black for an instant. Target creature gets -3/-3 until end of turn. But you can pay 1 and a black and exile Wither and Bloom from your graveyard, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Activate only as a sorcery. So we're seeing all these synergies for modified creatures, all these synergies when counters are placed onto creatures. And this lets you enable all of those, but on top of that, even in the decks that don't care about that much, it's just an efficient removal spell that can later put a counter on a guy. That's marginally relevant. But in the decks where it's relevant, it's insane. And in the decks where that's not relevant, it's still great. So expect these to go very early in draft. I think you play pretty much any number of these you can get. And then we've got Scurrilous Sentry, 3 and a black for a 2/3 Human Knight Rogue with Menace. Whenever Scurrilous Sentry enters the battlefield or attacks, it connives. If you've got non-land cards you're willing to discard, then this is immediately a 3/4 for 4, and then on its first attack, it can become a 4/5 for 4. Now, you're not always going to want to discard non-land cards off of these connives. Maybe they're important enough that you want to discard some lands, and then this thing doesn't get bigger. But it can get in with a relative ease because of that Menace ability. So very, very solid common, just a good 4-drop in black decks. And obviously has the ability to make itself modified via that connive if necessary. And if you have another way to draw a card, triggers those things that care about you drawing 3 cards in a turn. Best uncommons in black, we've got Wormcoil Larva, 3 and double black for a 3/3 Phyrexian Worm with Death Touch and Lifelink. When Wormcoil Larva dies, create a 1/2 black Phyrexian Worm with Death Touch and a 2/1 black Phyrexian Worm with Lifelink. Those are artifact creature tokens. So this is like half of a Wormcoil engine for 5, and it's black instead of colorless. But I think the big thing to note here is that the stats don't matter as much as just the fact that it is a Death Touch Lifelinker that then makes another Death Toucher and a Lifelinker when it dies. The value of that is very relevant. I think this card is an all-star. I'll be very happy to have them in limited decks. It's a great thing to put the cap on what an aggro deck has been doing to you throughout the game as a 5-drop, which is exactly before it's too late in most formats, as well as just being a great threat because it feels awful to trade with this thing, right? It feels terrible. They get another Death Toucher that they can trade for something else big you have, and another little Lifelinker. And then we've got Etched Slith, 1 and a black for a 1/1 Phyrexian Slith, another artifact creature. This one has Menace. Whenever Etched Slith deals combat damage to a player, put a +1/+1 counter on it. When you do, you may remove a counter from another target permanent or opponent. Even if you're not removing a counter from an opponent, which with energy is marginally relevant, the fact that this gets in easy in the early game and just becomes big enough that then it's hard for them to block with the Menace, very relevant. I think this is a good, pretty aggressive threat. And then we've got Marionette Apprentice, 1 and a black for 1/2 Human Artificer with Fabricate 1, which means it either gets a counter or you make a servo when it comes in, which is a 1/1 colorless artifact creature. Whenever another creature or artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life. So obviously you're going to usually want to choose the servo mode on Fabricate so that you have a creature or artifact to put in the graveyard to drain your opponent. That feels great. This card, is going to just be half of a Blood Artist, but with stats that you would just feel okay with playing. So this card's an insane uncommon. May see play in Constructed, I don't know. I guess this isn't a standard set, so the bar is that it would have to see Modern play, which I don't think it would, but all that aside, this card's great and limited. A 2/3 for 2 that drains your opponent when one of your things dies is premium, but just a 1/2 and a 1/1 is even better, right? You can choose to split up those stats. So really great rate here. Next, we're going to talk about the best red commons. Fanged Flames, 1 and a red for a sorcery with Devoid. Fanged Flames deals 4 damage to target creature or planeswalker. If that creature or planeswalker would die this turn, exile it instead. So this is basically Lava Coil except it's colorless for where that matters. Lava Coil has always been an effect we've been happy to play in Limited. Next, we've got Galvanic Discharge. I showed this off when I explained energy as a concept. As a single red for an instant, choose target creature or planeswalker. You get 3 energy. Then you may pay any amount of energy. Galvanic Discharge deals that much damage to that permanent. So if you don't have anything else that cares about energy in your deck, this is a Lightning Bolt. And that's, we're happy to play Lightning Bolts. Important that it can't target a player, but you can target a creature or planeswalker with it. And that Lightning Bolt is obviously a great rate for a removal spell. All that, but if you don't need all of that damage, you get some energy left over. And if you need more damage and you have energy left over, it's flexible in that way. So definitely a good card. Skoa Ember Mage. It is very seldom we get a common legendary, but it's important that it's common. So it's 4 and double red for a 4/4 legendary Goblin Wizard. When Skoa Ember Mage enters the battlefield, it deals 4 damage to any target. Grandeur, an ability that I honestly thought it would be very unlikely we'd see again. Discard another card named Skoa Ember Mage. Sacrifice 2 mountains. Skoa deals 4 damage to any target. So basically, once you land her, all future copies of Skoa are Fire Blasts. Grandeur is a mechanic that debuted in, I think, Future Sight block, and the purpose of it was basically, it's a tough sell to get people to play legendaries in Constructed, because you want to play 4 copies of your best card, but what if you draw multiple copies of your legendaries? So some cards had an ability called Grandeur that did something if you discarded an additional copy. And as they sort of started making sure they designed legendaries for Commander, which is a format where that problem obviously doesn't exist because it's singleton, they had no use for Grandeur. But it's really cool to see it back here as sort of a shout out, not only to the Grandeur mechanic, but also to Fire Blast. But all that said, this card on rate is pretty decent. 6 mana for a 4/4 that deals 4 to any target when it comes in. You can hit their face, you can blow up their creature, lots of options. But then if you drafted more Skoas and you need to just kill your opponent at some point, you can use them as Fire Blasts. Moving on to the best red uncommons, we've got Ral and the Implicit Maze. This is another one of these uncommons, that sagas that just sort of gives you more than it looks like it gives you. You got 3 and double red for Saga. Step 1, Ral and the Implicit Maze deals 2 damage to each creature and planeswalker your opponent's control. Step 2, you may discard a card. If you do, exile the top 2 cards of your library. You may play them until the end of your next turn. Step 3, create a Spellgorger Weird token. Now, that's a card from War of the Spark, I believe. It's a 2 and a red, 2/2 weird creature token with whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Spellgorger Weird. So this is another one of those cards that's just kind of greater than the sum of its parts. If you can line up that first mode as a one-sided Pyroclasm, then it's crazy. But then, you're drawing cards off of it, sort of, via that impulse draw. And then you're getting a creature token that might become relevant in size as the game goes on. So, definitely something worth considering as bigger than the sum of its parts. And then we've got Ghostfire Slice. 2 and a red for an instant with Devoid. The spell costs 2 less to cast if an opponent controls a multicolored permanent. Ghostfire Slice deals 4 damage to any target. So obviously people are talking about this as a new toy for Modern and Legacy Burn. Because, if you can kind of count on your opponent having a multicolored permanent, then this is an insane rate, right? It's strictly better Lightning Bolt at that point. But even if they don't control a multicolored permanent, it's still 3 mana for 4 damage, which is just passable in those burn decks. Now in Limited, 3 mana for 4 damage to any target goes from just passable to insane. Right? 4 is where we're starting to see the threshold of damage that's relevant to your opponent's life total if you're an aggro deck. And the fact that this can hit face is very relevant. But also, 3 mana, 4 damage, great rate on removal, especially as an instant. If they control their Signpost uncommon, then it's a single red for 4 damage to any target, which is a crazy rate. So, very powerful card. And then we've got Reckless Pyrosurfer. 1 and a red for a 2/2 human scout with haste and landfall. Whenever land enters the battlefield under your control, Reckless Pyrosurfer gains Battle Cry until end of turn. So whenever this creature attacks, each other attacking creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn. Each instance of Battle Cry triggers separately, so that means that if you have multiple lands come in through whatever means during your turn, this will get multiple instances of Battle Cry, and thus give your creatures like 2/0, 3/0, etc. So Reckless Pyrosurfer, Pretty solid uncommon. And then the last color we talk about before we move on to the limited archetypes is the best commons in green. And remember when I said that they just love referencing old cards in Modern Horizons 3? Well, here we've got Colossal Dread Masks. Colossal Dread Mask. 4 and double green for an equipment with Living Weapon. When this equipment enters the battlefield, you create a 0/0 black Phyrexian Germ creature token, then attach this to it. Equipped creature gets +6/+6 and has trample, and then this equips for 3 and double green. Now this card is, I think, way better than Colossal Dreadmaw, just because on base rate, it is Colossal Dreadmaw, right? That Germ is immediately going to become the stats of Colossal Dreadmaw for its cost. But then if that Germ dies, and the Dread Mask sticks around because it's an equipment, you can give something else +6/+6 and trample, right? The Nightmare scenario is obviously giving that to something with, say, Vigilance or Lifelink. But, I mean, even just the floor of putting that on, like, an Eldrazi spawn, and having the 6/7 trample, it's just crazy. So, Colossal Dread Mask, very solid, common, 6-drop obviously is a real thing. If this format ends up being aggressive, then this card will be awful. But, as far as 6 mana, 6/6 tramplers go, which is something we see in most limited formats, this is definitely one of the better ones. So fitting for a Horizon set. Then we've got Malevolent Rumble. 1 and a green for sorcery. Reveal the top 4 cards of your library. You may put a permanent card from among them in your hand. Put the rest into your graveyard. Create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token with sacrifice this creature, add a colorless. So the original Zendikar block had these Eldrazi spawn, which were these little creatures that you would build up a bunch of and sacrifice to let you cast your big Eldrazi. And this card is following in that tradition, right? Digging 4 cards deep to find a permanent card, which is either going to be a land you need to cast your big ramp target or your big ramp target itself, and then making a guy that can sack for mana later is just going to help you turbo out your big, greedy Eldrazi payoffs. So this card is definitely going to be exciting to see in those cases. It also fuels some minor graveyard synergies that the set has. And then we've got Eldrazi Repurposer. 2 and a green for a 3/3 Eldrazi drone with Devoid, so it's colorless. When you cast the spell and when Eldrazi Repurposer dies, create a 0/1 Eldrazi spawn. So I'm just going to say Eldrazi spawn for future reference. You'll know that it's a 0/1 you can sack to add a colorless. So yeah, I mean, even if it didn't give you one when it died, just a 3/3 and a spawn, great rate. The fact that it also gives you one when it dies is very relevant. Yeah, this is just a very, very solid body, very, very solid rate on a little bit of extra mana to help your future Eldrazi casting endeavors. So very solid common there. Moving on to the best green uncommons. Green feels a little dry at uncommon, I gotta be honest. It's got very strong commons, but it's uncommons. It was just kind of hard to pick 3 that felt very standout to me. So we're going to start with Signature Slam. 2 and a green for an instant. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Then each modified creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. So obviously, that first creature that you put the counter on is going to get to deal its damage, but if you have multiple modified creatures, they get to join in too, and so that makes this a pretty good bite spell on rate. Territory Color. 4 and a green for a 7/5 Eldrazi with reach. So 5 mana 7/5. It's got Devoid as well, of course, it's colorless. A 5 mana 7/5 reach, good on rate. 5 mana 7/5 we're happy to see. Now it's also got Landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, look at the top card of your library. If it's a creature card, you may reveal it and put it in your hand. If you don't put the card in your hand, you may put it in your graveyard. So this is Surveil, except also probably has like a 50-50 shot of just putting the card in your hand, right? Because the average limited deck is probably, I guess, a little bit less than half creatures. Since you're playing about 23 spells and 17 lands, and a little more than 3 of those spells are going to be non-creature. This card's great, obviously. Just a 5 mana 7/5 with reach would be passable. But the fact that you also get that crazy, you're drawing lands, it's hopefully going to help you find creatures to cast with those lands. Then we've got Trickster's Elk. This is, of course, a reference to Oko. It's 2 and a green for a 3/3 enchantment creature, Elk, with Bestow 1 and a green. And this is one of the few Bestow enchantments that doesn't just give the creature its stats as a buff. This actually makes enchanted creature lose all abilities and become a green Elk creature with base power and toughness. 3/3. So you're going to sometimes put this on like your own Eldrazi spawn just to get in for some damage. And then when it dies, you have the Elk left over. But very often what you're going to be doing with this is putting it on a creature that you're having trouble answering on your opponent's side of the field, making it a 3/3, which is a little easier to deal with. And then once you've traded with it, you actually get it back because you still control it as an aura. So, you make your opponent's threatening thing a 3/3, try to trade with it in combat or remove it some other way, and then you get the 3/3 that falls off afterwards. So definitely a very powerful card with a lot of versatility there. So now we're going to talk about the archetypes in this limited format. I'm going to go over the Signpost Uncommons, and you can see on the screen some cards that kind of synergize with them. I'm not going to read all of those, but I'll read the Signpost Uncommons and talk about how I sort of envision that deck coming together in draft. So the first one we're going to cover is green-white, which is modified, right? So modified, again, is that mechanic that cares about if your creatures have counters on them, if they have equipment on them, or if they have auras you control on them. So if you've augmented your creatures in those ways, they count as modified, and there are payoffs for that. So we're going to talk about Faithful Watchdog first. Now, one thing to note here, and this is going to be true of all the color pairs, there are Signpost Uncommons in most sets. This set, like other Horizon sets, also has Signpost Commons. So what that means is the set is a little more focused on gold cards, it's a little more focused on lanes, as well as, making it a little bit more generous of a splashable set compared to most. Maybe not compared to Outlaws of Thunder Junction, because the Desert deck is insane at splashing in that set. But, compared to your average limited format, splashing is going to be more incentivized because of all the powerful gold cards you have access to in the packs. But anyway, this one is Faithful Watchdog, green and a white for a 0/0 dog with Vigilance. Faithful Watchdog enters the battlefield with 3+1/+1 counters on it. So, very cool. 2-mana 3/3 Vigilance is a great rate if you're in green-white. And then the fact that you can proliferate those counters is relevant for a few possible cards, but also just the fact that this creature, by default, counts as modified is worth a lot. And green-white cares a lot about modified, as you can see here with Golden Tail Trainer. 1 and a green and a white for a 1/3 Fox Samurai. Aura and equipment spells you cast cost X less to cast, where X is Golden Tail Trainer's power. Whenever Golden Tail Trainer attacks, other modified creatures you control get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is Golden Tail Trainer's power. So the more you modify this guy, the less your later artifacts and equipments cost, and the more powerful your other modified creatures get. So, it's a little rough if you can't modify him, but if you can, he's a house. Definitely a very powerful build-around for a Signpost Uncommon. And then we've got Lion Umbra, which is a powerful aura that can only enchant a modified creature, and Guardian of the Forgotten, which gives you some value in the form of manifests when your modified creatures die. Moving into the white-blue archetype, we've got Energy Midrange, and the common here is Riddlegate Gargoyle. White and a blue for a 2/2 artifact creature Gargoyle with flying. When Riddlegate Gargoyle enters the battlefield, you get 3 energy, and whenever you attack, you may pay 2 energy. When you do, target creature you control gains lifelink until end of turn. So what we're seeing here is that a lot of the energy cards in this set will give you 3 and then spend 2, which allows you to sort of have more versatility in the way you spend your energy, and pays you off a little bit for having more cards that give you energy. This one in particular, relatively strong. Then we've got Inspired Inventor here, do that sort of fabricate or gain 3 energy counters. And then Tune the Narrative, which is just an instant draw card. You get 2 energy for a blue. And then we've got the uncommon, Signpost Uncommon for white-blue energy midrange is Emissary of Soulfire. 1 a white and a blue for a 1/4 Jin Monk. When Emissary of Soulfire enters the battlefield, you get 3 energy counters. And you can pay 2 energy counters to put an Exalted counter on target creature you control. Activate only as a sorcery. So what Exalted does is whenever a creature attacks alone, not necessarily the creature with Exalted, just when a creature attacks alone, that creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So you can exalt the creature itself, you can exalt a token you have sitting around to make it so that when the creature attacks alone, it gets more powerful. I think often you're going to be exalting the Emissary of Soulfire itself, because you'd rather leave your 1/4 up to block, and then let something else get in. And we've got Static Prison. This is sort of a pacifism effect, or rather an O-ring effect for a single mana. but it gives you 2 energy, and you have to spend an energy every pre-combat main phase to keep it around. So, not going to be a great investment, although it feels great to answer a token with this, because then you just get the 2 energy, and you don't care if this sticks around. And we got Royal Cartographer, which is landfall, get an energy, and you can pay 6 energy to draw 3 cards. More useful, more realistic to gain advantage out of that first ability than out of that second one, but definitely something to consider. We're going to move on to blue-black. The archetype here is drawing 3 cards in a turn, which seems like a high bar. It seems like a big ask. But there are plenty of cards that can let you draw 2 cards, and then you count your card for turn, and that's 3. So it's sort of a harder to do, but better payoffs version of the blue-black archetype from Brothers War, if you played during that set. So we've got Sneaky Snacker. She just like me for real. Blue and a black for a 2/1 fairy rogue with flying. When you draw your 3rd card on a turn, return Sneaky Snacker from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So, this is a great, you just play it on rate early in the game, it gets answered. Later on, you draw 3 cards, you get it back for free. That's crazy. Happy to have any number of these in my deck. And even if you don't make the returning to the battlefield aspect of it work out consistently, just a 2-mana 2/1 flyer feels fine to play. Then we've got Horrid Shadow Spinner. 1 a blue and a black for a 2/3 lifelink. Whenever Horrid Shadow Spinner attacks, you may draw cards equal to its power. If you do, discard that many cards. So it's a little awkward to get to attack with this just because of the body being below rate. You have to find a way to protect it if you want to keep it around. But this is a pretty insane signpost uncommon for this deck, specifically just because every time it attacks, you meet the condition for your cards that care about drawing a 3rd card each turn, because you've drawn for turn, and then this thing has 2 power, you're drawing 2 more cards. So even if you have to discard them, that still counts for those abilities. So definitely something to watch out for. Brain Surge we've already seen, and then Mindless Conscription, letting you amass when you draw a 3rd card each turn, and also just being a 3/3 for 3. Then we've got black-red artifacts / graveyard. There's a little bit of graveyard going on. It's mostly kind of an affinity deck. So we're starting with Cranial Ram, which is a riff on cranial plating, classic affinity powerhouse. So this is a black and a red for an equipment with living weapon. So, again, comes in with a Phyrexian Germ, 0/0, that it's attached to. And then equipped creature gets a +X+1, where X is the number of artifacts you control. So the +1 is to keep the Germ alive, mostly. But it's at least going to be +1/+1, just for this Cranial Ram. Ideally, you'll have other artifacts lying around. Obviously, this isn't like Modern Horizons 2, where the artifact lands are in the format, but there are plenty of just decent cards that happen to be artifacts. Artifact creatures lying around. Other living weapon equipments. So you can easily make this a relatively powerful card, and then you can re-equip it to something else for 2. And that is the Signpost Common. The Signpost Uncommon feels a little greedier. It's Pyretic Rebirth. It's 2 a black and a red for an instant. Return target artifact or creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Pyretic Rebirth deals damage equal to that card's mana value to up to 1 target creature or planeswalker. So, and it is an instant. So this card is pretty powerful, and I apologize. I got it mixed up with a different card. I'm not sure why. This is not greedy at all. This card's very good. So the only thing that it's kind of asking of you is that you have an artifact or creature in your graveyard with a high enough mana value to answer your opponent's thing, and that's not always going to line up, but when it does, this is absurd. It's a Raise Dead and a removal spell for 4, and that is just premium. Not much else to say about it. Next, we're going to move into Red-Green Eldrazi, and this, like the energy deck, was one I thought it would be kind of hard to make come together just because of the very specific thing it's asking you for, but they did a nice job of designing it in a way that's organic and blends well with the rest of the limited format. So this first Signpost Common is Writhing Chrysalis, 2 a red and a green for a 2/3 Eldrazi drone with Devoid. When you cast this spell, you make 2 Eldrazi spawn, which, already pretty crazy, if you're trying to ramp into something big. And then it has Reach, and whenever you sacrifice another Eldrazi, put a +1/+1 counter on Writhing Chrysalis. So you sack those drones, or those spawns rather, to make something else, and this, becomes a 4/5. And a 4/5 Reach for 4 is not bad. You can also, the threat of activation is very real, because if your opponent is attacking, they have to treat this like it is already a 4/5, because you have the ability to sack those 0/1s and just not care about the mana. They have to treat this like it is a 4/5 when they're attacking, so you kind of get the benefit of it being a 4/5 without actually having to sack the tokens until you're ready to spend the mana. Then we've got Titan's Vanguard, the uncommon. The GOAT, Richard Kane Ferguson, putting beautiful art to this card, so shout out to that. But it's 3 a red and a green for an uncommon Eldrazi with Devoid. It's a 5/5. Whenever you cast this spell, and whenever Titan's Vanguard attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on each colorless creature you control. And of course, that's going to count the few colorless artifact creatures in the set, but it's also going to count all of your Devoid Eldrazi, right? So all the Eldrazi in this set are Devoid, so it's going to count all of those. It's going to put a counter on each of your Eldrazi spawn as well. Very important to remember that. And yeah, it's just a 5-mana 5/5 trample that buffs your other colorless cards. This card's going to feel great as kind of a curve topper for an aggressive Eldrazi deck, or just a decent card to include in general in your ramp deck. You can turn your 0/1s into 1/2s. That's got to count for something. And then there's a couple cards here as well. Spawn Gang Commander is sort of an Eldrazi variant of Siege Gang Commander that you can read here. Path of Annihilation, as well as maybe a more greedy, slow burn sort of card, but it definitely does something. And then we're going to move on to the enemy color pairs. We've got red-white energy aggro first. So starting things off with Conduit Goblin, the Signpost common. Red and a white for a 2/2 Goblin Warrior. When Conduit Goblin enters the battlefield, you get 2 energy. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you may pay 1 energy. If you do, another target creature you control gets +1/+0 in haste until end of turn. So you can spend those energy to make your other creatures just get in for damage earlier, which is obviously what you want in an aggro deck, or you can spend them on something else. And it's worth noting that even if you spend both the energy from this, now all of your creatures that make energy when they come in have the option of having +1/+0 in haste. So it makes all of your plays a little bit more flexible. So definitely a very solid Signpost common. And then we've got a couple of other good aggressive common energy creatures, Smelted Chargebug and Hexgold Slith. I think if there's a successful aggro deck, I wouldn't put money on it, but I feel like if there's a successful aggro deck in this format, it's going to be a very low-to-the-ground red-white energy shell. And then we've got the Signpost uncommon, Scurry of Gremlins. 2 a red and a white. When Scurry of Gremlins, it's an enchantment, sorry. When Scurry of Gremlins enters the battlefield, you create 2 gremlins, they're 1/1 red creatures. Then you get an amount of energy equal to the number of creatures you control. So you're going to get at least 2 from those 2 gremlins you just made, but ideally more. And then you pay 4 energy. Creatures you control get +1/+0 in haste until end of turn. So, if you already have 2 creatures, you can immediately give everything +1/+0 in haste. That's pretty relevant. Crazy things can get crazier if you have more energy, if you control more creatures, and you don't have to spend this energy on Scurry of Gremlins. If you have a better outlet for it, then you can definitely make something else of it. It seems like a versatile card. I will say it doesn't seem as strong as the other Signpost uncommons. I feel like it maybe could have been tuned a little better, but I don't know, maybe they tested it at paying 3 energy for that effect, and it ended up being too strong, so they had to settle on 4. Time will tell. The format will tell. I feel like there's enough dials on this card that could be turned that it's probably tuned correctly, even if it looks a little bit underpowered to me as I read it now. And then we've got Unstable Amulet, a source of dubious card advantage in the form of paying energy to exile the top card of your library, and you can play it, and when you cast spells from other places other than your hand, it pings your opponent for 1. And then Voltstorm Angel, a sort of Sarah Angel variant, right? It's a 4/4 flyer for 5 that gives you 3 energy when it comes in. And at the beginning of combat, you can pay 2 energy, so you get to keep 1 of those energy, to give it Vigilance and Lifelink until end of turn, or to give your other creatures +1/+1 until end of turn. So great curve topper for an energy aggro deck. Next, we've got the white-black color pair, whose deal is also modified, similar to the Golgari deck, which we're going to get into shortly, and the green-white deck, which we got into earlier. But this one kind of specifically cares about modified creatures dying. So Obstinate Gargoyle is the Signpost common. 1 a white and a black for a 2/2 Gargoyle. It's an artifact creature. It has flying as long as it's modified, and it has Persist. So when this creature dies, If it had no -1/-1 counters on it, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a -1/-1 counter on it. So that's a 3-mana 2/2. When it dies, you get it back as a 1/1 flyer that by default counts as modified. So definitely a decent card. And then we've got Ondu Knotmaster, which reuses the adventure mechanic from the Eldraine sets. So this is 2 a white and a black for a core rogue, 2/2 with lifelink. Whenever another modified creature you control dies, put 2 +1/+1 counters on Ondu Knotmaster. So very solid. And then it's got the sorcery on its adventure, throw a line, white and a black for an adventure, distribute 2 +1/+1 counters among 1 or 2 target creatures. So that adventure can kind of can modify 2 of your creatures, and then when those creatures die, they can make the Knotmaster bigger if it's landed at that point. So definitely a pretty versatile card, pretty decent rate. Might be awkward to line up, actually putting counters on him himself, but that sorcery adventure is fine. Maybe it ends up being more than the sum of its parts. Seems a little difficult to line up, but I probably wouldn't be too mad to have one of these in my draft deck. Moving on to black-green, which is more focused on counters, but it is modified in general. And you're kind of seeing a theme that like these 3 colors in Abzan line up. We're going to talk later about the possibility of playing 3 colors in this format. Spoilers, I think it's very doable, but we'll get into that a little more later. We're going to start with Expanding Ooze, the Signpost Common, which this might be the strongest Signpost Common. It's 1 a black and a green for a 3/3 Ooze, with Adapt 1 for a black and a green, so, very doable. And then whenever Expanding Ooze attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on target modified creature you control. So worth noting that even if you just have this, you don't have any other stuff that cares about modified, which, I mean, you should if you're in this deck, but even if this is the only thing you have out at the time, you can immediately adapt it, turn it into a 4/4, and then when it attacks, you can target itself. It doesn't have to be other things. So you can immediately make it a 5/5 when you're attacking there. So decent aggressive card, but also just the fact that it can buff a creature you put a bestow creature on, or some similar. Just very, very versatile. Easy to get through as a threat. There's not going to be many boards where you can't attack with this and at least trade. After adapting it and putting a counter on it from the ability. Also, it's a recurrent way to put counters on things that care about having counters put on them, like this Dream Drinker Vampire here, which gets Menace when you put a counter on it and has lifelink. So, a lot. Or this Basking Broodskill here, which creates a spawn when you put a counter on it. So, very powerful synergies that this Expanding Ooze can enable. And then we've got the Signpost Uncommon, Cursed Wombat. If only he could find some sort of Wombat Sanctuary. That's a deep cut for the real r/custom magic bottom 5 heads. This is a black and a green for a 2/3 Nightmare Wombat. For 2 a black and a green, it can adapt 2, becoming a 4/5. Permanents you control have, whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on this permanent, put an additional +1/+1 counter on it. This ability triggers only once each turn. So worth noting that he gives this ability to himself too. So that adapt 2 is actually sneakily an adapt 3. But it also affects your other adapt creatures. I don't know if I am sort of reading these wrong or like misevaluating them, but it really feels like the Expanding Ooze is more powerful than the Cursed Wombat. Way more versatile, for sure. It's strange to me that they're not switched in rarity. It feels like the Cursed Wombat should have maybe been the common, and the other one should have been the uncommon. Maybe it's a complexity thing. I guess there's a little more text on this one, but honestly, if I'm offered a pack with the Ooze and the Wombat in it, I'm probably taking the Ooze. But regardless, that is the Signpost Uncommon here, and it's a very solid card. I know I'm kind of talking down on it compared to the common in the same colors, but it's definitely worth playing. It's very powerful, just not as powerful as that insane Signpost Common, I feel like. It is a 2-drop also. And then moving into green-blue, this is a ramp deck with a very strong Eldrazi bent. So, you can ramp out other things, but it's really trying to nudge you toward Eldrazi. So we're starting with Snapping a Void Craw, which is 1 a green and a blue for a 1/3 Eldrazi turtle with Devoid. You can tap for double colorless, or you can pay 3 and a colorless, and tap it to draw a card. So, If you have some other method of gaining colorless mana, this can draw you cards, but if you don't, this is just crazy ramp, right? So turn 4, you play another land, and then you have access to 6 mana immediately, 2 of which is colorless, which is very relevant for some of these cards that are like kicked with colorless mana, or just require colorless mana natively. So definitely solid. The body's a little rough, so if you don't have any synergy with these abilities, it's going to feel pretty terrible to just play a 3 mana 1/3. But, in the right deck, this card is definitely a little nasty. Also, speaking of nasty, sweet art. And then we've got Planar Genesis, which is a more generic ramp card as the Signpost Uncommon. It's a green and a blue for an instant. Look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may put a land card from among them onto the battlefield tapped. If you don't, put a card from among them in your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this is sort of like Impulse, but if you get a land, you can put it in tapped. So decent ramp spell, instant speed, gives it a little more flexibility. Happy to have these. We've got Propagator Drone and Depth Defiler, which are more some payoffs for ramping and specifically ramping with colorless energy. Or sorry, colorless. I've been playing a little Pokemon TCG. Colorless mana, excuse me. I guess there's also energy in this set, so my tongue twister is a little more justified. Speaking of energy, we've got Blue-Red Energy mid-range up next. So this is another one of those Energy Matters decks. And again, you might start to notice a theme where we're kind of looking at some 3-color, some potential tricolor decks where the Jeskai colors all kind of care about energy. But we've got the Signpost Common Cyclops Superconductor. 1 a blue and a red for a 2/2 Cyclops Wizard with Prowess. When Cyclops Superconductor enters the battlefield, you get 3 energy counters. When it dies, you may pay 3 energy. When you do, Cyclops Superconductor deals damage equal to its power to any target. So, little awkward to line up, getting the prowess high enough that it can, remove something when it dies. But, I mean, that could kind of be a trick. Like a 3-mana 2/2 that shocks something when it dies is good, because it can trade up. Dream Scenario, it can trade with another 2/2 and then kill another 2/2 if the board lines up that way. The board's not always going to line up that way, but when it does, you're going to feel pretty happy to have this. I think the card's fine. And then we've got Izzet Generatorium. The Izzet love making up words. Blue and a red for an artifact. If you would get 1 or more energy counters, you get that many +1 instead. Tap, draw a card. Activate this ability only if you've paid or lost 4 or more energy this turn. I don't know about you. This seems very greedy. It feels like they always do this to the Izzet Signpost Uncommons, where it's a card that does stone nothing without other cards. It's a card that does not have a floor if you don't have other enablers, and for that reason, I'm very reluctant to call this card good. But it is the Signpost Uncommon of these colors, so it bears meditating on it. This deck is good, I just don't think this card is what makes it good. You'd be hard-pressed to sell me on a deck that includes enough energy cards that this feels like it does something relevant. You have to have a way to pay that 4 or more energy in a turn, and a lot of these cards are not letting you pay energy without also tapping the thing or paying mana, which reduces the likelihood that you're going to be able to pay 4 energy, because most of these don't have a 4 energy cost necessarily, so you're going to have to be paying into multiple things. It just feels very inconsistent, to say the least. But the deck itself, you're going to be competing with the red-white aggro deck for cards on the red half, but I think there's definitely some powerful cards here. You've got some good removal that just scales up with your energy, so I'm not necessarily discounting the deck. I think it's very, very possible that it ends up being solid, especially with the splashability letting you play the gold cards from the other Energy Matters decks. So, next we're going to be talking about the best bombs in the set, and this is actually pretty short. It doesn't look like the set's going to be super bomby to me. There is a ton of power in the commons and uncommons, as there was in the last Modern Horizons, that sort of prevents the rares and mythics from feeling as bad, because you've got powerful synergies, powerful build-arounds, and just independently powerful cards in your own deck, even if you don't have busted bomb rares. But we're going to go over what I regard as the most powerful bombs in the set, rares and mythics that you should definitely look out for, that you should groan if your opponent plays them, that kind of, maybe are worth pivoting in draft, etc. So we're going to start with Arna Kennerud, Sky Captain. 2, a white, a blue, and a black for a 4/4 legendary human knight with flying, lifelink, ward, discard a card. Now, if it stopped there, that's a fine rate. You know, I'm very happy to include that in my deck. But also, whenever a modified creature you control attacks, double the number of each kind of counter on it. Then, for each non-token permanent attached to it, create a token that's a copy of that permanent attached to that creature. So if you get an equipment or an aura with bestow, then you're really cooking with this. It's crazy. But even if you don't, just those counters, and even if you don't have those, a 4/4 flying lifelink for 5 with ward that makes them spend an extra card to answer it is already insane. So very happy to have one of these. You want to get it early so you can build around it, or get it late when you're already in 2 of those colors. You can splash for it, but it's not too much to ask. Then we've got Flage, Titan of Fire's Fury. So for those who were fans of the Titans from Theros Beyond Death, Kroxa and Uro, we got another one here, which I'm very happy about, and it mechanically fits with the other one. So what it is it's 1, a red and a white for a 6/6 Legendary Elder Giant. When Flage enters the battlefield, sacrifice it unless it escaped. Whenever Flage enters the battlefield or attacks, it deals 3 damage to any target, and you gain 3 life. And you can escape it, of course, for double red, double white, exile 5 other cards from your graveyard. So, floor on this, 3 mana, Lightning Helix. Feels great. You're happy to play Lightning Helix in any format. It's obviously 2 colors, but that's not too big of an ask. And the fact that if you have 4 mana and 5 cards in your graveyard, instead of just Lightning Helix, you also get a 6/6 that Lightning Helix says whenever it enters or attacks. Just insane. Yeah, Kroxa and Uro, both very solid and limited. This one, I dare say, is better than either of them. Obviously you got to fill up your graveyard, but that's just not that much of an ask. So this card is crazy in draft. Just getting that double red, double white, is all you really need. Crabomination. I don't know if I'm being biased just because I love this card. I think it's really sweet. I love stealing cards from my opponent, and I just think the concept is really cool. But Crabomination, 4 and double black for a 5/5 crab demon with emerge from artifact. So you may cast the spell by sacrificing an artifact and paying the emerge cost reduced by that artifact's mana value. The big crazy thing here is like playing an artifact that has affinity, so you're not casting it for as much and then sacking it into this. Whatever. You're completely fine with paying this for 6 mana as a 5/5, because what it does is, when it enters the battlefield, target opponent exiles the top card of their library, a card at random from their graveyard, and a card at random from their hand. You may cast a spell from among cards exiled this way without paying its mana cost. So it is very unlikely that you don't hit a spell from this, right? Maybe they don't have a card in their hand, maybe the top card of their library is not gas, but the graveyard tends to mostly be spells. You have to be intentional about getting a land in your graveyard, so you're probably going to get something out of their graveyard, and they don't get to pick what they're exiling from their hand or their graveyard, or obviously the top of their library. So you are likely to get a hit off of this, and like the worst case scenario, you don't get anything off of this. It's a 6 mana 5/5 that exiled a card from their hand, right? But you are going to get something off of this, and you get to cast it for free. So, not the spell itself, obviously. You get to cast the thing you get off of Crabomination for free. So, hard for me to believe that this card will not be great and limited. And then we're going to move on to some more bombs. We've got Dreamtide Whale. 2 and a blue for a 7/5 whale. What's the catch? Vanishing 2. This creature enters the battlefield with 2 time counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, remove a time counter from it. When the last is removed, sacrifice it. But whenever a player casts their second spell each turn, proliferate. So shout out real quick before we get into analyzing the card. Shout out to Ron Spears. This art is gorgeous. I love what he did with this piece. Cards pretty powerful. I mean, anytime a player casts their second spell, which is not just you, but your opponent, you can be intentional about it to keep this thing alive. But they will have to be intentional about not doing that to hopefully let this thing die. That's the proliferate, so it doesn't just put counters on itself to keep it from vanishing. It also lets you put more counters on your other things with +1/+1 counters, but notably, proliferate also affects players. So you can choose to give yourself extra energy when you cast your second spell each turn if that's something your deck cares about. So a lot more relevance in that ability than you'd think. Obviously, this only gets to attack once if you can't proliferate, if you can't do that double spell, or if your opponent doesn't double spell, but that'll happen a lot more often than you think. And if this thing attacks twice, that's backbreaking, because it's a 7/5 for 3. Crazy body for a blue spell. And then we've got Ophiomancer. Now, this is not a new card, but this is a new to modern card. And the only limited formats that this has existed in before has been Cube. I think it might have been in one of the Commander Legends, Commander Masters sets. I didn't draft those very much, obviously. But it's definitely been in cubes, and it's an all-star in most of the cubes it shows up in. So it's 2 and a black for a 2/2 human shaman. At the beginning of each upkeep, if you control no snakes, create a 1/1 black snake creature token with Death Touch. Now, it's always, you got to check for shapeshifters, because it's always feels bad when you don't make a snake and you realize, oh, it's because I control a token made by this thing that I forgot is all creature types. But I digress. This card's very strong, right? And even if they answer it, it's almost definitely already made a snake with Death Touch, which is, 1/1 Death Touch is a great body. It makes your opponent's attacks very bad. And as well, if they go to answer the Death Touch creature, they can't really go into combat, because if they go into combat and the Death Touch creature gets used up and they can't answer the Ophiomancer, you just get a new one. It's like they did nothing. So definitely a very awkward card to play against, and that makes it very powerful. And then we've got Psychic Frog, a blue and a black for a frog, 1/2 at rare. Whenever Psychic Frog deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, draw a card. Discard a card, put a +1/+1 counter on Psychic Frog. Exile 3 cards from your graveyard. Psychic Frog gains flying until end of turn. So, of course, the fact that it can get flying, which makes it an insane way to draw a card, very powerful. But the real thing here that you have to be aware of if you're playing with or against this card is that threat of activation, right? However many cards your opponent has in your hand, you basically have to treat this as though it already is that big, right? If I have 3 cards in my hand, my opponent has to treat this as if it's a 4/5 when they're blocking it, because it can be. But then there's the damned if you do, damned if you don't of like, if I don't block this, I'm just giving them a card. If I do block this, I'm letting it eat my creature if they're comfortable with discarding enough cards from their hand. So a card that is just real tough to deal with. You basically have to remove it. But again, that threat of activation, if your removal is damage-based, I might be fine with discarding enough cards to keep this alive, because it's going to draw me those cards right back off of that first ability. So, a card that I think will maybe be underestimated, but is going to be very powerful. So, we are done with the bombs, and now we're going to move into the tips and tricks of the format. This is the advice I just want to drop on you real quick before the end of the video, so stick around to hear that. We're going to start talking through the tips and tricks. So first, important to note, this set has common fixing. Gorgeous art on that Tranquil Landscape by Randy Gallegos, by the way. But anyway, there's a cycle of 10 of these, so each wedge and each shard gets one. They're all common. They tap for colorless, or you can tap and sacrifice them to fetch a basic land of one of its 3 colors, put it in tapped, and shuffle. So in the case of this Tranquil Landscape, which is the Bant one, you can get a basic forest, plains, or island, put it on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. And then these also cycle for a green, a white, and a blue, or whichever 3 colors they are. So if you already have all 3 of your colors and you don't need that colorless mana, you can just cycle this, draw a fresh card. But if you need the mana untapped, you can have it colorless. If you need that colorless mana for activating your Eldrazi abilities, you have that colorless mana. And if you don't, you have a fetch that can grab 3 different land types and put them in tapped. So these cards, I think, will go early just because of how good they are in decks that care about colorless, or in decks that need fixing to play a 3rd color. But like they're definitely very powerful, so expect them to go early. Expect them to enable decks that are splashing in a way you wouldn't think is necessarily viable in a format like this. And then we've got, I want to just do a brief discussion of like which 3-color decks I think are going to be viable. I don't think all 3-color decks are created equal in this format, but there is a ton of incentive for players to mash the Jeskai energy cards together into a deck that makes use of all of the more efficient ones. As well, I think there's a huge incentive for the modified decks to go together. The signposts between green-black, green-white, and white-black just kind of making a very powerful deck, very splashable, lots of ways to modify creatures in those colors, and payoffs. That if you're able to have access to all of those pretty powerful gold cards, your deck's just going to be higher in card quality than your opponent. And then as well, the Eldrazi, this one's a little more obvious, right, because they all have the same creature type and sort of the same mechanics, caring about colorless mana, but you could play a Temur Eldrazi deck. And I think of the three-color decks that I'm highlighting here, I definitely think the Temur is going to be the hardest one to put together because it really does demand very specific like creature types and like the Devoid mechanics specifically, where rather than these more general mechanics, especially like modified. But I do think it can come together. You can have a deck that's not too strained on mana, that's playing these big Eldrazi that are like 6-7 mana, and these Eldrazi that care about colorless. So definitely worth considering. And then one more thing I wanted to note real quick. Baffling decision, in my opinion. I don't know why they decided to do this, but there is a tiny chance that you will get specifically one of the face commanders or backup commanders of the new commander decks in your draft packs. They are legal in draft. Not all the new cards from the commander decks can show up here. Specifically, the commanders can. So to highlight this, I put the two that I think are the best in limited. That's Kaith, Famed Mechanist, and Korum the Undertaker. One of them cares about Lurgoyfs specifically, which, like, this set has, I think, one Lurgoyf at Mythic, so, not something you're going to be seeing a lot of. And then, like, there's a card that makes all your lands all land types and all your creatures all creature types. Not relevant in limited particularly, so, a lot of these cards are just going to be traps. Don't know why they're in there. These two cards are very powerful. Also don't really know why they're in there, because, like, if you really need copies of these, you just buy the precon they're from, right? Or buy them after someone pulls them out of a collector booster. But regardless, they are here. They will appear less often than a normal Mythic. But this is less in here to offer strategic tips related to these cards, and more in here to allow you to clear up confusion at your pre-release when someone inevitably opens one of these cards and says, why is this set symbol different? Or this is a card from the commander deck. Am I allowed to play it? Is my opponent allowed to play it? Etc. So just be aware of this. I don't know if they've said it anywhere else, but I found it hidden at the bottom of an Arena weekly announcements, and I don't know how many drafters read those all the way through. So yeah, just be aware of that. With that said, I want to thank you for joining me for another limited set review. I'm very excited to play this set. I think it'll be a lot of fun. My general impressions of Outlaws of Thunder Junction were positive, although I know reactions to that broadly were mixed. And I am very excited to play this set. I think it's going to be really fun. It's a bummer that it's more expensive than a regular set in paper. But, it costs more to print expensive cards than it costs more to print powerful cards than it does to print weak cards. So yeah, this set's sweet. I think it'll be fun to draft. I'm really excited to dive into this limited format. I had my reservations at first because I was like, how are they going to support Energy and Eldrazi? But it's the kind of thing where, Wizards of the Coast's Studio X design team are smart people. And, when they sat down in front of the whiteboard and hammered out the initial idea, I'm sure if they couldn't have done it, they wouldn't have tried. And, if they couldn't end up hammering it out, they would have scrapped it and made a cleaner product. So I'm sure that it does play well, because if it fell at that hurdle, it wouldn't have gotten released in this way. So I'm very excited to try out this limited format. I want you guys to let me know what you think. I love discussion in these videos. I hope you'll leave a comment telling me what cards you're most excited to play with, what archetypes you think are going to be the most fun and synergistic, which ones you don't think will work. A lot of people are not bullish on the blue-black draw 3 cards, understandably, because that's a hard thing to do, but, maybe it comes through. Maybe the deck comes together. So just let me know what your thoughts are in the limited format before it goes live. And with that, thank you for joining me for another one of these. Feel free to hit me with a subscribe, a like, a comment, and I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope you have a wonderful time playing limited with Modern Horizons 3. Thank you.